So welcome everyone. We're very happy you can join us. So my name is Ina Ganguly and I'm an associate professor of economics and associate director of the Computational Social Science Institute, or CSSI, at UMass Amherst. And CSSI is really delighted today to co-sponsor this event on the replication crisis with the Institute for Social Science Research, or ISSR, at UMass. So we're really excited about this panel today. It brings together, really, top experts from psychology, economics, and computer science for an interdisciplinary discussion of this very timely topic. They're going to discuss key issues in the debate about the crisis, including potential causes and remedies to increase the replicability and reproducibility of research. So we have three panelists, and what we're going to do today is we're going to give each of them about 10 to 15 minutes to give initial remarks. And then we're going to open up for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and then at the end, after everyone has spoken, we'll go to those questions and do the Q&A. And so we'll call on you to ask your question. One thing to note is that this is being recorded. So if you ask a question, you will be on the recording. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first just briefly introduce the three panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them. So first, we're going to have Brian Nosek, who's co-founder and executive director of the Center for Open Science that operates the OSF Collaborative Management Service for registering studies and archiving and sharing research materials and data. Brian is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia. He co-founded Project Implicit, a multi-university collaboration for research and education investigating implicit cognition. Then we'll have Anna Draber, who is the Johan Bjorkman Professor of Economics at the Stockholm School of Economics. Her research is mainly on meta-science and behavioral economics and focuses on replications and predicting replication outcomes in economics and psychology. She also explores topics such as hormones and economic decision-making. Anna is a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and an associate editor at the Journal of Political Economy. And then we'll have our own David Jensen, who is a professor in the College of Information and Computer Sciences at UMass Amherst. And he's also director of CSSI. He directs the Knowledge Discovery Laboratory. His current research focuses on machine learning and data science for analyzing large social, technological, and computational systems. His work focuses on methods for constructing accurate causal models from observational and experimental data. So thank you again to everyone for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian to get us started.
Thanks, Ian. I'm delighted to be able to be part of this conversation today. The task of the initial summary points of 10 minutes for me, I think, is just to put some context setting on what the evidence is on a couple of these dimensions for challenges for reproducibility and replicability. There's probably some general familiarity with why there's been consternation about potential concerns for these issues in the field. It comes down in the summary form to a perspective that the reward system and system of incentives and interactions, if how research is evaluated, does not align with how we could maximize the credibility and reproducibility of the research that's produced. Publication is a key incentive driving researcher behavior. And to the extent that some things are more publishable than others, we create a context where researchers might intentionally or unintentionally do things that end up producing a literature that's more exaggerated, more beautiful than what the reality of the evidence is. So for example, positive results are easier to publish than negative results. So we may unintentionally create a publication bias, both in self-selection when I'm writing up papers, what gets included, and then also in the selection process through peer review, what ends up getting published that creates an exaggerated literature compared to the reality. Likewise, I might be making different decisions as I analyze my data and rationalize to myself solutions that look better for publication as being the right ways to analyze and report those outcomes, which may then overfit p-hack, whatever other terminology you would like to use, that creates the appearance of quality results, but at the cost of their credibility because of the decision process that went into it. So I won't say more about that context other than to note that there's now been a lot of investigations across disciplinary domains for seeing whether the literature is as credible as we might presume it is on its face. And these are in three different, largely in three different buckets of activity. Replication, which in this context refers to testing the same claim with new data. Robustness, which is testing whether the claim based on this data is contingent on the particular decisions in the analysis pipeline, and does variation, reasonable variation in those decisions alter the result that's observed. And then reproducibility, taking the same data and the same analysis pipeline and seeing if you can just reproduce what it is that was originally reported. I'll tackle the replicability and reproducibility briefly, and I think Anna is going to say some things about robustness in the next 10 minutes. So I just want to highlight one research example of tests of reproducibility. In this case, Artner and colleagues took a number of different 46 articles from different psychology journals where they were able to get the raw data and tried to reproduce the findings as they were reported in the article. And what you're seeing here is their summary of the different claims they tested, where in orange or red are when they failed to precisely reproduce what was reported in the article, and in white, they were able to reproduce the finding in the article. So about 70% of the time, they were able to reproduce the reported results. A lot of the failures were trivial in seeming to be transcription errors or rounding errors. Some of them, particularly ones in red, led to a decision error, right? Calling something significant that wasn't, for example. So that kind of challenge to reproducibility was apparent in this sample. And this is a context where you would presume that really it should be 100%, right? Reanalyzing the same data with the same analysis plan should yield the same result. So failures below 100% suggest areas for improvement. But a lot of trivial things that we would say aren't really challenging to the credibility of the results. What they really complained about in the paper were actually the white squares, where they were able to successfully reproduce the result. Why were they complaining? They were complaining because it was so hard to actually reproduce it. They started with reading the methods section and analyzing the data the best they could. It didn't match, and so they had to tweak and tweak and tweak and adjust. And then finally, they get to a model that showed the same result as what was in the original paper, oftentimes with back and forth with the authors and otherwise. And they're sort of saying, it shouldn't be this hard. We should be better at sharing just share the original script, for goodness sake, and so that I can just rerun it and see that the results recur. So that was the major theme of their paper. And that theme has come up in every area that's bothered to investigate reproducibility of findings or reproducibility of the code producing the output, as in the case of Kohlberg et al. For computer science abstracts. So this is a pervasive challenge of we are not meeting what would presumably be an important standard for being able to show the credibility of the evidence of what it is we report. So that's all I want to say about reproducibility challenges and their prevalence, just to seed the conversation. The other part that I want to mention is the accumulated evidence of systematic efforts to try to replicate findings in the literature. And there are lots and lots of ad hoc now replications. This particular finding someone is interested in or wants to challenge or is skeptical of, and so they conduct replications. What I'm showing you here are efforts that were systematic in some way. In the first three columns are efforts where they identified a sampling frame of experiments or papers and did as many replications from that sampling frame as possible to minimize selection bias and cherry picking. And what you're seeing in the on 0, the dotted line, is if the replication effect size was the same effect size as the original finding. Above the line would be the replication showed a larger effect size than the original study, and below the line, smaller effect size. And then in standard null hypothesis significance testing, if you got the same direction and a significant result, the dot is black. And if it was non-significant or in the opposite direction, the dot is white. And what you can see overall across these, and then the fourth column being large-scale multi-site replications, ad hoc selection procedure, but done many, many times across different sampling setting contexts, is that in these almost all psychology or behavioral science tests, 64% of the replications were significant in the same direction. And they tended to be somewhat smaller on average. 68% as large as the original studies. So this is accumulating evidence with a variety of different sampling strategies that that failures to replicate are not that uncommon, and smaller effect sizes from originals are not that uncommon. Now that says nothing about why, right? Is it because the originals were false positives more likely or exaggerated? Were replicators screwing it all up and that's why they couldn't get the same effect sizes? Or they're contextual variables that weren't taken into account that explain why variation. But that's the meat of the discussion and debate, which has actually, I think, been largely a very productive one for trying to understand replicability and research credibility. I just want to close with a quick example on the solution side so that we get to it, which is the potential for improvements in transparency of the data that are produced and the methodology that was used to create that data, and then pre-registration of making very clear what was planned in advance in terms of analysis strategy and approach, and what things were unplanned, responsive to the data in some way. These have been offered as ways to both make it easier to detect potential challenges and to conduct replications of original research or reproductions, but also potentially to increase the credibility of the findings that come from those studies. So we did a project which was a prospective replication project. My lab at the University of Virginia, and then labs at UC Santa Barbara, Stanford, and Berkeley, where we were, each lab conducted their own research, trying to discover new things. And every time that they found something that fit the eligibility criteria for this, it got entered into a prospective replication project. So ultimately, each of the 4 labs found 4 novel findings of stuff that they do research about that fit the project parameters. And then once it was entered into the this pipeline, the original lab did a confirmation study that was pre-registered. Here's what the design is. Here's the analysis plan. Here's the result from that. And then they would hand off their report to the next lab. So it was open materials, right? Here's how we did our research. And then the next lab would have to recreate the experimental context and do the experiment again. They would run a replication, then would get handed off to the next lab, the next lab, the next lab. And even the original lab would have to self-replicate later in the process. So ultimately, there were 16 self-replications and 48 independent replications of these novel findings. The idea was, let's try an idealized pipeline where you have confirmation tests, you have pre-registration, you have sharing of materials, and see if we could improve compared to that, what I showed you before on the reliability of the findings, the replicability. And this is a summary plot of each of the 16 findings, where the confirmatory test in yellowish orange, its effect size compared to 0, the dark vertical line, with its 95% confidence interval. And then each of the replication studies done by independent labs in green and by the lab itself again in blue. And what you can see at sort of a quick glance is that there's a fair bit of consistency. In fact, if you aggregate across these, the independent replications were 97% of the effect size of the confirmatory studies. And if you put that in the presentation format, like the first slide I showed you on replicability, you can see that the dots on the far right column cluster very closely around the 0 line, suggesting that the effect sizes are quite similar and showed very consistent results. So at least as a proof of concept, it's suggesting that high replicability is achievable. Now, what factors accounted for high replicability in this context? That's much harder to determine based on what evidence we have available. But it's really, for us, was an opportunity to set a benchmark. We can do better, than what the standard literature is. And now let's maybe start to use that as a mechanism for starting to argue about how and investigating what are the most productive parameters to try to improve the reliability, consistency, validity of the research that we do. So I think that it's probably exceeded the 10, but maybe not the 15 minutes I was allocated. So I will stop with that. So thanks very much for your time and attention.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll turn it over to Anna Draper.
Great, thanks. I'm also going to try it. I will probably go over 10 minutes, but not, but I will also try to make it shorter than 15. Okay, so how do I just see my full screen? Sorry. Okay, so I want to cover a lot during a short amount of time. So let's see how this goes. So now we know that some results don't replicate. We also know that some do replicate. So we can discuss super briefly some reasons for false positive and false negative results, some solutions like pre-analysis plans and registered reports, and then also discuss a little bit other ways to think about results. So coming from multiverse analysis and also multi-analyst projects. So there are, of course, many reasons for why results don't replicate. Brian has already talked about publication bias. Here's a super nice paper by Franco et al. Where they follow the fate of 221 social science experiments, and where results are basically pre-registered, or studies are basically pre-registered. And as you can see, null results are super likely to remain in the file drawer. They're not even written up and of course not shared with the world, whereas strong results are way more likely to be published and very rarely remain in the file drawer. So which results can we actually trust? That's going to depend on many things. What's the p-value of the statistical test? What power do you have in your statistical test? But also things like the various researcher degrees of freedom. So I think most of you probably know what these are, but I'll spend just a couple of minutes on them. And then something like priors. So what's the probability that the hypothesis is true in the first place? This is something that we're typically not incorporating into standard statistical testing, or at least explicitly addressing, but maybe we should to a larger extent. So we'll come back to that. Okay, so the various researcher degrees of freedom, we all know we shouldn't go fishing. If you have enough variables in a data set and you test enough correlations, of course, something, even for true null hypothesis, something will be statistically significant by chance. And that's, of course, misleading if that's the only thing you're then presenting to the world. And then there are these other phenomena which are more common and more intuitive and more natural in so many ways, and not necessarily intentionally misleading, but anyway misleading. And these would be p-hacking or forking from the garden of forking paths. So in p-hacking, you may be testing a specific hypothesis, but you haven't specified exactly how you will test it. So let's say you have an experiment. There are many so-called researcher degrees of freedom in how you can get a statistically significant result. So here's from the very nice paper by Simmons et al. From 2011, where they basically show that for your given significance level, say p less than 0.05, what is the actual likelihood of obtaining a false positive result, depending on the researcher degree of freedom that you're involved in. And when you start combining these very natural things, like dropping some observations, collecting many dependent variables, many outcome variables, having many treatments, but only reporting those where you have statistical significance, interacting gender with treatment, etc., you're very likely to end up with a false positive result, even though you have a p less than 0.05 result. And that's, of course, problematic. And that this is in no way a p-value bashing thing that I'm doing. I think p-values can be super good. We just want them to be meaningful, right? And this obviously does not lead to meaningful p-values. The other type of practice would be forking. And this is basically a multiple testing problem where the universe of tests is not clear. So you let the data decide how you will analyze it. And this is supernatural and, of course, can be very interesting. But at the end of the day, when you have some statistically significant result in a subgroup or something, what have you actually learned about the world? The p-value is, again, basically meaningless. So these are reasons for why we can have false positive results. And to what extent do we have this? So Brian has already talked about reproducibility and replicability. So I just wanted to throw in one slide which tries to address p-hacking in economics. And there are many related papers using similar methods. So for lots of data, observational data, non-experimental data, it's hard to replicate, obviously. Like, how can you get new data testing the same quasi-random experiment or policy change or whatever it is? So at best, maybe you can do a robustness test or reproducibility exercise. and it's hard to redo the whole policy experiment out there. So in these studies, they will look for missing tests, sort of missing test results, p-values between, in this case, 0.10 and 0.25, that seem to show up for many types of literatures in economics below 0.05. So that could be interpreted as evidence of p-hacking. I mean, even if you don't find evidence of p-hacking visually like this, there could still be p-hacking going on. That depends on how your tests are correlated, but we don't have time to get into that much. But this is a super interesting literature. Okay, so one way to solve this would be to have more pre-analysis plans. And if you want to read more, I mean, Brian has written about the pre-analysis plan or pre-registration revolution. That's a super nice PNAS paper. Many people are now advocating increasingly for this. So why do we like pre-analysis plans? Because they remove the researcher degrees of freedom. They basically make you able to distinguish between confirmatory and exploratory results. I mean, exploratory analysis and results can be super interesting. The problem is just when they're presented as confirmatory. So this allows you to distinguish between the two types of results. And a natural and super exciting extension of this are so-called registered reports. So registered reports are basically like these enhanced pre-analysis plans where you have the introduction, etc. You haven't run the study yet, but you submit it to a journal. Your planned study, whatever it is, experiment or observational data, gets reviewed. And then the paper gets accepted, no matter, hopefully, no matter the outcome. So it doesn't matter whether you get positive results or no results later, the paper will be published. And this is obviously a great way to avoid publication bias. So this is common now in medicine, pretty common in psychology. In economics, there's only one journal that has a permanent track, and that's Journal of Development Economics. So I think sort of in economics, we should push more for this, and I hope this will increase in other fields too. Accounting, Journal of Accounting Research, one of their top journals, they have a registered report track. So things are happening, and that's good. But at the end of the day, the pre-analysis plan, and I love pre-analysis plans, they are one fork in the garden of forking path. But it leads to meaningful p-values. That's why we like pre-analysis plans. But of course, many potential forks are possible. And depending on which researcher you ask, you might get a different fork or a different pre-analysis plan. So pre-analysis plans shouldn't result in any systematic bias in effect sizes, but they could underestimate the standard error of your statistical tests. And then the question is, how big is this sort of additional uncertainty? So this could be explored in many ways. And one would be to use the so-called many analyst or multi-analyst approach. What's the natural variation in analysis and results in a given data set? And the other way would be to look at what's the theoretically justified set of analysis and results in a given data set. And this latter can be explored with either multiverse analysis, vibration of effects, or specification curve analysis. These are basically the same things with different names, so popped up in different literatures, but trying to tackle the same thing. Basically doing all types of analysis you can and look at the distribution of results and try to learn what do we actually know for this question. So here's from the landmark paper by Silbersan et al., where I think Brian was the senior author, where they gave the same soccer data to a bunch of different research teams and asked these teams to test basically whether referees were more likely to give red cards to dark-skinned players. So here's the variation in effect sizes across these 29 teams. So 20 out of 29 teams find statistically significant positive results, but there is quite some variation also among these teams in their effect sizes. So since this paper that I guess was published just 3 years ago, but it was around for a longer time, there are many other multi-analyst approaches. So I'm just giving you some examples here. In neuroscience, my co-authors and I were involved. This was led by Rottenbutt, Tine Knetzer. We did a project where we had a large data set of fMRI data that we gave to 70 different teams. We asked them to test the same 9 directional hypotheses on the same data, and we basically found tons of variation in results. There are related examples in economics on replications by Huntington Klein et al., sociology by Bresnau et al., Schweinsberg et al. And this is sort of becoming a bigger field, bigger topic for study. So there's a very new paper by Axel et al. In eLife on consensus-based guidance for multi-analyst approaches, if you're interested in this. So I can show you our latest stuff, and then I will stop talking, and I hope I haven't run over time. So this is from a project in finance. So we got access to the German stock exchange data, basically on micro trades. We were able to get this data and share it with researchers. So we invited researchers in finance to look at this data, test the same 6 hypotheses on this really big data. We managed to recruit 164 research teams. And then we want to see, okay, what is the variation in results for these 6 hypotheses, and what happens when we introduce some review elements? Basically, can we reduce this variation in results? And the short answer is like, we get tons of variation in results here for this financial data. And the review element does some, but it doesn't take away the variation results. So that's sort of what I wanted to cover. So now I'm done. Thanks. Looking forward to hearing what everyone thinks and your comments and questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anna. Next, we have David Jensen.
All right. So I'm going to, I think, echo many of the themes that Brian and Anna have talked about. And I'll also note that I feel like, they're the professionals in the room. I'm kind of an amateur at this, but delighted to be sharing the stage. I will talk, I think, about a very specific way in which we can think about this sort of problem and how some aspects of the replication crisis are kind of built into the system that we have, yet there are steps that we can take to deal with them. And so one of the sort of basic ideas here, I think, is that the structure of the scientific enterprise actually can produce bias. And Anna has referred to some of this, and let me just give a very specific definition of it. If we have a system that produces a large number of items, say a large number of studies of similar phenomena, and each of those studies has some variability in the distribution it's sampling from. So it pulls out a specific, say, effect size, but that's estimated with some variability because of finite data samples. And then there's some process that looks at a set of those studies and selects out the study that has the best score, say the highest effect size. Then you are guaranteed that the effect size that's estimated from that process is going to be biased positively, because it's going to be larger than the actual effect size is under the assumptions that I've listed here. Now, this is something that I've actually studied with respect to machine learning algorithms, because these algorithms automate this process, but this basic process shows up in a lot of the kind of internal processes of science right now. Let me give you a very specific example. So suppose we have 2 studies. Each of them has some sort of effect size that it's estimating. The actual effect sizes differ because they're looking at slightly different phenomena, but we're selecting from those distributions. Any one study selects from those distributions. And let's assume that we have actually 4 studies and they all have exactly the same effect that they're trying to estimate. And then we come along and we actually perform the studies, which means that we get samples from those distributions. And then there's some publishing process that looks at those studies, or some set of researchers who looks at them and decides which one to select. And unsurprisingly, they're going to select the one that seems most interesting, has the largest effect size. And that is going to be the 3rd study. And that is going to systematically select out a study that's got something that is typically out in the tail of the distribution. And that's certainly going to happen if we have even as few as 4 studies, but typically if we have a much larger set of studies, if there's a large scientific field that's studying this sort of effect, then you're going to see an even stronger bias in that final selected out study. Now, as Brian and Anna have pointed out, this is already well known and been looked at for at least more than 40 years. This idea of publication biases that are kind of built into the system. And it's even XKCD has even talked about this, where we have a study about whether jelly beans cause acne, researchers come back and say, no, they don't. And then someone says, well, wait a minute, maybe what about specific colors? And so the researchers look at, purple jelly beans and brown jelly beans and pink jelly beans and blue jelly beans and on and on. And what a surprise. In one case, we come out with an individual study that appears to be significant at the 0.05 level. And then, of course, the resulting, press report is going to call that out. And this is, certainly will happen in the case that I've talked about, where all of these studies have the same variability and the same effect size. But imagine that we have, say, a somewhat sloppy study somewhere in the set that has much higher variability. Unsurprisingly, that study is more likely to be selected for because it is more likely to have a score that is way out in the tail of the distribution, and that's going to produce even more positive bias. That might even swamp out a case where, due to a particular change in the research question, there actually is a higher effect size of some study, but that might not be chosen in this kind of process because of that high variability of that other study. And this bias crops up, as we've already talked about, in individual studies with the garden of forking paths and choices that a researcher makes. It shows up in publication when there's a bias toward publishing studies with large effect sizes. It shows up in what gets publicized. There's a lot of papers published across the scientific literature. Which ones are going to receive the most attention? Probably the ones with large effect sizes. It even shows up in terms of possibly what studies we choose to replicate. I was very impressed when Brian talked about, no, we're going to replicate all of a set of studies within a sampling frame because we don't want to have a particular bias toward only trying to replicate studies with large effect sizes. But when individual researchers are doing ad hoc replications, they might choose to pull out those studies that are particularly large effect sizes that may seem particularly unlikely to replicate. And it even might show up in what we choose to publish and publicize about replications. Those replications that are most, show the biggest difference between the original and the replicated study might be ones that people will particularly talk about and publicize. And this gets worse, of course, the more researchers we have, the more papers we have, the more access we have to papers for publicity purposes, the greater access to unreviewed papers that may contain errors, and the greater publicity we have about various kinds of scientific findings. And so there are various ways that we can do better, and Brian and Anna have already talked about a fair number of these, but we can do a variety of things to help individual researchers do better, including practices like pre-registration and how we choose to do reviewing and those sorts of things. But there will also, I think, always be research groups that don't take as much care with those things. And so we also should think about more kind of systemic things that we could do. For instance, encouraging replicability. Brian talked about the kind of having open materials and ways to make that replication easier. Encouraging in the research literature the ability to transparently revise research findings so everyone knows about those and can tie back to the original findings. Making sure that we don't stigmatize that kind of revision because there is just natural revision that's going to go along, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's fraud or misconduct. And even doing things like changing hiring and providing long-term rewards. In computer science, we have what are called test of time awards. And also in social science, the Cochrane reviews are a good example of kind of really long-term recognition of research that stands up over the long term. And so I will end and turn it back over to Ina.
Okay, thank you all for those great presentations, and I think a lot of topics that we can kind of jump off on to discuss. So why don't we start with Katie Keith? Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you to all the presenters. This was a fantastic panel. I am just curious, like when Brian was talking about reproducibility, I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the medium of scientific communication. So, right, like historically, these were, gentlemen scholars that were exchanging letters back and forth, and that became our journals. But now we live in like this digital age where we can have code interspersed with explanations of what it does. And so is there any sort of broader initiatives or efforts in the social sciences or in other scientific publication venues to try to integrate these more and not have it be a separate artifact from the way that we're actually communicating this itself?
That's a great comment, Katie. Yes, when things were tied to paper for communication, it's no surprise that we develop these standards of let's summarize what we can of our methodology and of our analysis in words, and then others will have to deal with it based on that, because there wasn't another option. But obviously the internet changes that computation, and we haven't caught up in how science is communicated with what opportunities it provides. There are efforts, so let me link one. This is a link to a fully computationally reproducible article in eLife. It's a life sciences focused journal. I know it well because the article itself is part of our the Center for Open Sciences reproducibility project in cancer biology. And the final papers for that are coming out next week. But the goal was, let's see if we can stitch all of these services that are being developed together so that you could interact with the article. Right? You see the graph and you say, I don't know about that exclusion rule. I want to change it on the fly and recompute and see what the graph looks like when I change it. Right. So really cool possibilities for if we look for ways to make this a more dynamic form of communication that readers can really interrogate the evidence. So you notice the date on the top of this was February 2019, and this wasn't the first effort of lots of people have seen the potential here. eLife doesn't have this as a standard for their articles, despite this. And I think there are a couple of reasons that we haven't gotten that far. One is that it's a big ask of authors. So in a world where other journals are not making such a big ask, am I going to go to the one where I have to do all of this stuff to make my thing fully computationally reproducible? Well, if it's AER, I might do it. And they've instituted strong requirements for demonstrating reproducibility of findings. But they can, because everybody wants to get into AER. It'll change my career as an economist. So that's one. The second is that there isn't really much money in it for the publishers to implement these expensive workflows, all of the hosting costs. There's a lot more that comes with making papers reproducible in this way that are avoidable costs, because why do I need to take that on as a publisher? So I think the possibility is very available. The reality is going to be harder to achieve based on the current economics of the system. So, but great idea.
Right. Actually, just to follow up on that, I was curious because when you mentioned AER, and so I was thinking about that. And one thing that's kind of come up is that it's kind of creating some inequality among the researchers at institutions where they have access to more students and RAs who can kind of help them do that. And so I was curious about your thoughts. And I don't know, Anna, I don't know if JPE has a similar policy, another journal everyone wants to get into, but it's also, there are, kind of 5 really well-known journals, and not all of them require this. So I think what you're saying, Brian, is really important, that you can go elsewhere.
Yeah, so I mean, many of these journals will have someone who helps with the data and makes sure the code runs, etc. And so I think that's excellent. There should be more of it, and I don't see the reason why a journal wouldn't have that. But maybe it's too costly. So I guess we have to put some pressure, and in particular in these journals that are actually led by researchers and not by professional editors and other things. So what but there are some problems arising when you mainly have confidential data, which would apply to lots of research in economics and finance. You can't share the data. And how can we then try to think about replicability, reproducibility, robustness, and everything? So that's obviously a big problem. And I don't know how we should what we can make authors do to convince us that we should think their results are reliable, even though we can never access their data. The other thing is what I'm worrying about sometimes when I see open data. Okay, I see the open data for the subset of data that showed up in the paper. What about the rest? All the pilots, all these other variables or treatments where there was nothing. Where is that? And I think in particular, if you're sitting with some really big data set where you have these uncorrelated outcome variables, and you sort of do the p-hacking in a way that, oh, I test this one hypothesis, I don't find anything, throw it away, test a new outcome variable, what happens there? Oh, here's something, that would be my data set. If I then look at the data, of course I can reproduce it, maybe it's robust, etc. But it is misleading. What do we do about that? I haven't thought much about that, so that's probably something David and Brian have thought more about, or you, Ina. So throwing it back to you now, or you, Katie.
So I would point out also a challenge as a computer scientist, which is that that code may run now. It is unlikely to run in 5 years. It's very unlikely to run in 20 years. And so I love the idea of having a paper that is modifiable on the spot, where you can make different changes. But I think the thing that's going to last longer probably is archiving code, where you can at least look at the code and say, well, I see what it does, I may re-implement it, or may have to make some minor modifications to make it run on modern hardware.
Yeah, that's a good one to raise. And of course, people are working on containerizing some of these things, but it's a hard problem at scale. So you can do it sort of in a micro level, and then all of the variations make it really tough. On the point Anna raised about confidentiality of data and how that can interfere with reproducibility, I'll put a couple more links into the chat of different environments that have been created for sensitive data sharing that also enable really effective reproducibility. So these two, Open Safely is in the UK for accessing electronic health records. And then Vivli is a consortium approach of a variety of different clinical trials, pharmaceutical companies that have these data sets that they cannot share or just will not share, but they are willing to have other people analyze data from them. And so both of these use an enclave kind of approach, right? As the researcher, I can create my code and submit it, but I never get access to the data. It goes to the system, it's analyzed there, the outputs are returned to me. And there are a number of these that have emerged in different subfields where they want to try to get as far as they can on rigor and transparency, but they have real limits, proprietary or ethical, that stand in the way of doing that entirely in the open. And so I think because there's enough fields that are thinking about these issues, there are almost all use cases have an example, and we just need to figure out how it is that we can extend those to the variety of domains that wrestle with the same kinds of problems.
So I have a question for Brian and Anna, if I can jump in, which is what you think the kind of contribution is of researchers merely knowing that these procedures are in place, which makes them do different research and be more careful and thoughtful about their choices. If I'm going to pre-register, I'm going to think out my design much more carefully, et cetera, versus the actual value of doing those things. Not like I'm suggesting deceiving people, but there are both those forces operating. Could you give a sense of what you think is happening there?
Yeah, great question. I'll give first. I'm sure Anna has more things to say on it. The knowing that someone could look is probably the most important part of these interventions, because there's already too many papers, right? We're not reading all the papers. Having the data available too, well, I'm really not going to look at all the data. So open data is not now everybody's going to flock and look at my tiny little data set for this little thing I investigated and try to unpack it. It's really a check for me. I'm going to share this so that someone could. And that, I think you're exactly right. It does change my perspective on the preparation and the thoughtfulness I need to go through for that, for my own accountability's sake, whether or not anyone else ever does it. There's an anecdote that comes up in many times when I go give lectures, especially when I'm focused on pre-registration, where someone will come to me and they'll say, the paraphrase, it almost happens the exact same conversation. I tried out registration once. I was like, I might as well try it. And I registered my study and put it all down. Then I forgot about it. And we had our data, we analyzed, and then I remembered, oh yeah, I have that pre-registration. And I went back and I looked, and my analyses were totally different than what it was we planned. And I was so surprised. And this was so useful because then I went back and analyzed it that way, and I see how it is I changed without even realizing I did it. And So, so I'm never going back. I'm going to pre-register everything. But for me, it's emblematic of exactly your point, which is that was useful for me, the researcher, to have that check, because I move on, I get busy, I forget all of those things that are totally natural. And so now I have this record to help me meet the goals that I had from the outset. So thanks for that. Anna, what else do you got there?
I don't know if I have that much else to add, but so I feel like lots of the forking and some of the p-hacking is not really intentional. I mean, in the sense that you do want to find something. It's so much more fun to find something than not find something. So you sort of allow yourself to forget that what you wanted to test originally. So what if I control for this, or like focus only on women? Well, I mean, gender is always interesting, etc. It's so easy to sort of make yourself believe that this is a super exciting, surprising result. So I guess if sort of the threat or the promise of replication is out there, that's a possibility, maybe you just sort of become a little bit more careful. So like, okay, I'm going to replicate myself, or ideally team up with someone else who can replicate it, like do an independent replication before pushing it too much. And I guess many others would say, well, a paper is never sort of the final word. We don't put much weight on a single study. We care more about sort of the accumulated research, but papers are often written sort of a little bit like in a mix of like, this is of course not the final thing, but still this is sort of, now we really learned something about the world. And I don't know exactly why I'm saying this. So maybe that's, means that I've said enough on that question.
Okay, no, thank you, Anna. Thanks so much. I want to make sure we get to, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. So let me just turn over to Aaron Shine.
Hey, everyone. So thanks for this discussion. My question is just about sort of the role of the surrounding prose and argumentation in a paper that reports the causal effect. I think, it's a really tough problem to change the incentive structure. It's obviously a good one to attack, but in the meantime, are there sort of best practices or protocols that we can develop to make a certain estimate more credible, just in terms of, contextualizing it with existing theory or with some sort of descriptive modeling or descriptive statistics to sort of lend more credence to the claim. Of course, that runs the risk of then, the confirmation bias. So there's a trade-off. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm happy to start the commenting on that. It's a great question, and you're right that it relies on our reasoning and good reasoning in these contexts. But of course, most of what our work does relies on that. So why don't we take some effort to see how is it that we can improve? My favorite of the relatively simple self-administered interventions, besides pre-registration and these other things, is the section on constraints on generality in a discussion. So Daniel Simons, Yuichi Shota, Steve Lindsay advocate for this. And the idea is sort of complementing a limitations section. Here's some weaknesses in our materials, is really sit down and write out where you think this generalizes and where it doesn't. And go by, the methods, go by setting, go by sampling, go, all of the different factors. What are the boundary conditions that you yourself are confident and not confident in? And put a stake in the ground, right? Is acknowledging, where does your evidence say that you could potentially generalize here and where doesn't it? It doesn't get everything of what you're suggesting, but for me as a practical exercise, it has been super useful, especially in the collaborative context with colleagues, of thinking, what do we really think this means? is sort of walking through and writing that out basically as our own commitment in a discussion section for how we think about those results. So that's the first thing that came to mind in response to your thought. David or
So I
Anna?
think that's an excellent idea. So very good question, Aaron. So I hesitated answering going first. So I'm glad Ryan did. So I mean, writing something like that in the discussion, that would be a fundamentally different paper or fundamentally different discussion part of an economics paper compared to what we see now. Whereas you're instead sort of writing like, maybe this is vaguely related to something, and I will write down all these something basically to make it super broad. So the opposite of putting some limits to generalizability or how we can extend it. So, and I'm not sure I should be saying this, but like when I talk to lots of economists, what I often hear is that, yeah, psychologists, they might have a replication problem because they don't have serious theory the way we do, because we have our really mathematical models trying to understand whatever we're interested in. So that puts all these constraints on sort of what we can test and leads to less p-hacking, less forking, more reliable results, etc. And I just don't think there's much evidence for this attitude. I mean, the theory is often so flexible that you could get anything, and it's not that precise. So what does it mean that you're sort of not finding support for your theory? And when there's this paper by Brodeur that I showed, there they look at where they look for evidence of p-hacking. They compare papers with models to papers without models, and there's evidence of p-hacking in both sets of papers in these top journals. So I think theory is for sure super important here. I mean, that you have some guidance, but I want that theory to show up in the pre-analysis band or do some multiverse based on all theoretically justifiable ways to look at the data or something.
I'm particularly amused, Brian and Anna, to hear you saying, oh, there just isn't enough discussion of the threats to validity. Because when I started getting into social science and reading more social science research, I said, wow, there's this really great idea of threats to validity that I feel like I got from social scientists. And I brought it, and told my students in my research methods class, and my computer science students, oh, we should be talking about threats to validity. And they said, what is this thing? This is really amazing and impressive. And I will say that there are parts of the computer science world, particularly in some work in software engineering studies, which tend to be more human-centered, that do this, that have a section on threats to validity. And I totally agree with both of you that that should be much more prevalent. In fact, I would be very happy if paper reviewers would say the paper is deficient because it does not adequately identify all the threats to validity, that should just be, a part of a paper. And instead, what I see certainly in students in computer science is they say, well, if I put that in there, I'm just going to get hammered by the reviewers because they're going to use all those arguments against me. And I've actually seen reviews that do this as well. Rather than celebrating those things being in the paper, they actually turn around and say, well, clearly the paper's deficient because it has these limitations. And so that's a very challenging thing to do, but I will certainly note that many, great scientists throughout history have done this. Darwin's book, Origin of Species, has this amazing section where he says, here are things that will be fatal to my theory. And goes down some, absolutely serious threats to validity, none of which turned out to be the case, but it was, a really bold section, I thought, to put in there. And I reference that when I talk about threats to validity.
Okay, thanks. So let's turn it over to Mark. Petricky has a question.
Thanks, everybody. This is a fantastic panel, and I'm really glad that you all took your time individually to come talk to us today. My question revolves around faculty mentoring graduate students in these areas, and I'm in sociology. It doesn't seem to have caught on as much as in psychological sciences, and certainly across other social sciences. I'm wondering if there are concrete, illustrative cases or activities that you sometimes share in your training of your students to drive home just how important this is. And I realize that, part of this is me modeling as a mentor, in that I need to be doing more pre-registered reports. I need to be enacting these practices myself and I model some of them, but I also came of age in my training in an era, the late 2000s, when this was not being talked about as much. And so I feel like in some ways I'm playing catch up along with our students too.
So I'm guessing Brian has thought way more about this, but just like how I would be teaching, how I would be teaching like our econ students at the bachelor or the master level, I think like getting them to read all these like the Simmons et al. False positive paper, the Garden of Forking Paths, the Type M, Type S error paper by Genman and Carlin. I can send you all these references if you send me an email. And like giving them some data and asking them to sort of find support for some hypothesis that we don't believe in whatsoever, and how easy it is to do that. Sort of you get them to p-hack a little bit themselves. I think that's a pedagogical exercise, but something a bit related. So I think Brian and David should jump back to what your question was actually about. So I'm skipping a little bit to something else too. In terms of mentoring students, my biggest problem mentoring PhD students and master students, maybe more PhD students than master students, is about how do you make them, you encourage these open science practices and getting reliable results, etc. Then of course they are more likely to get null results from their experiments. They have higher power, so it's a more interesting null result, etc. But how they are then sort of not performing super well in that academic job market. They would have performed better if they had these researcher degrees of freedom. So how do we make sure that now we don't sort of select those that are the least serious, sort of, that we make them stay in academia and have this most serious people leave? So that's my big problem.
Yeah, that is a potential challenge for sure. And Mark, you mentioned coming out of sociology, there is a real challenge with social norms in facilitating the change of these practices. And psychology and economics have a much stronger community engagement on this. So it's almost impossible for grad students to avoid the sense of, oh, something's changing here and I need to pay attention to it. And that doesn't yet exist in sociology for reasons that we could discuss and debate. And it's emerging in some of the other social sciences or applied sciences in sort of fits and starts. Education, it's starting to get some heat. Marketing and management, sort of like people like saying, oh, maybe there's something, but boy, my salaries are really good at this business school, so I'm okay with whatever. So that is, you have headwinds with where it is already. But to add to some of the thoughts that Anna suggests, I'll give two article suggestions that were, as discussion items, were helpful in contexts like this. The first here is this paper we wrote that just said, okay, let's just write a paper about what's in it for me to do this, right? Not appeal to good values and I just want to do robust science, but no, my career will benefit from doing this. And so it will help me in some way. So this was sort of the best mustered argument that could generate at the time to support that with whatever evidence was available, that there is a case for self-interestedness in this. And then the other that might be useful, I think this is a great, oops, if I can get the copy and paste this, there's a great annotated list of entry points. Oh, I'm not getting the copy here. It's called 7 Easy Steps into Open Science. Well, I'll find it and tag it after I stop talking. But it's just trying to give what are the most accessible articles that people can potentially read and sort of see themselves in it in some way of why that particular behavior might be of value. And you may be already familiar with many of the ones that they cite, but I just find it a really good sort of overview piece to sort of pick and choose, given the context of where things seem to be resonating with this group of students or department. Where might we get started? So I'll pause with that, see if David has things to add.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
There it is. Thank you. You got it. Thanks, Dave.
I'm definitely going to be adding both of those readings to my research methods class, because that's exactly the argument that I need to make, and I really resonate with Mark's sort of concern about how do we educate people and get them to maybe be in advance of our particular community, and go out there, and the argument actually that both Brian and Anna have pointed to of sort of like this idea that it's actually going to you've got to argue somehow that it's going to do people good. It's going to be a good thing for your career to do that. And what I point to is I say, how one of the things I talk about is how bad it is to have 3 or 4 or 10 years down the road, your finding that made your career turn out to be false. And I actually have them read some papers where something turned out to be completely wrong, and provably so. And that's, they look at that and think, okay, I don't want that. That would be bad. And also what I try to point to is say, look, good research practices at the individual level are going to allow you to move fast to a finding that is robust. And that it's actually sloppiness or high variability can cost you as an individual. And so I try to make the case for actually having really good practices, even though the particular thing you do never sees the light of day, it guides where you go next. And so you want to have those findings. And that's easier to do in computer science because we have a very fast decision cycle. We don't have to go out and collect human subjects data, get stuff approved. It's not a 6-month process or 1-year process. It's sometimes a 2-day process. Not with all CS research, but there is that kind of thing. And so that's the argument I try to make, at least to CS students.
I think those are definitely adaptable, I think, for sociologists as well. I want to give that some more thought. Thank you, David.
So I'm typically not the cynical, but here I am a little bit today, in the sense that I agree with everything that you said, and I sort of wish I could also truthfully say this and believe in it to like PhD students in economics, and I can't fully sort of say that truthfully, in the sense that still the system really still rewards you to have some confidential data set or from a national statistics agency that is very hard for others to access. And if you don't PHAC, at least fork and just present the robustness tests that work and have some model that you have once you've seen the results. And then you're set compared to like, oh, I'm going to try to have a super clean pre-analysis plan ahead of time and show the results no matter what they are, etc. But maybe this is just economics, and maybe it's just in sort of my cynical part of the world or something. But
I think it's a really important issue to raise and be attentive to, because there is a reality, right? Do I get to get a job? Do I get to keep my job? And the same issues. So I think I have 2 sort of general responses to it. One is that I think it depends on where the field is on its trajectory. The same issues would come up every time I would speak to early career psychologists, 5 years ago. It's like, I'm nervous to do these things because I want to have a career. Now that conversation is gone in psychology. It's not that everyone is doing it, but the norms have shifted sufficiently that I think most grad students see it as a cost to not do them rather than to do them. Whether the actual hiring practices have all caught up or not, is not clear. There's not a strong enough evidence base, but certainly the community ethos is strong enough where it's sort of like, oh, you're not pre-registering. What's that all about? Kind of thing. And certainly there are people that are active haters or whatever of it, but nevertheless, that it's the pendulum has shifted. I suspect econ is on its way there. Perhaps not.
I hope so.
Yeah. And then the other was that making the argument, even for those places where it is not yet clear, is sort of giving the broader context. Look at what's changing here. It's not just within the fields that the methodologists are crowing about. The funders are paying attention to this, right? NSF, NIH, DARPA, funders outside of the US, lots of attention to this among them. Boy, even policymakers are paying attention to this, right? There was a hearing just a couple of days ago in the UK that Marcus Munafo and Dorothy Bishop presented to a committee on science about the challenges of the research culture and what should they change as Parliament on how it is that this operates. So pointing to that stuff and saying, look, change is coming. It's up to you which side of that you want to be on, given the risk profiles that you perceive. And then it's also up to you of how you want to be as a scientist. You could either make decisions purely based on what is it that it's going to get me the rewards, or you can make decisions on how I want to do my science. And if you appeal to values, almost everyone lands on the values of transparency. Like, why would I get into science if I wanted to be secret? Like, that's not, I can make a lot more money being secret doing other things. People that are in academic research sort of recognize these values as, yeah, of course, that's what we idealize. It's just pragmatically, we're not there. So those are broader elements, at least, that I try to nudge as best I can.
One question is about, I guess, like, yeah, thinking about PhD students. And when we have this great class, I see Michael Ash is here for our PhD students in economics, and it's, a class where they do replications, and there have been some kind of high profile, studies out of that. I don't know if Michael wants to comment on it, but one thing that I just saw that made a little bit of a splash, at least on Twitter, was that there's a new journal of replications in economics. And I was just curious, and I don't know how much, like, if Anna, you've heard about this, but going back to this idea of like which studies are chosen to be replicated also then leads to these issues. And so, I mean, is that something like having these journals where people can actually publish replications only, or should it be something, where do you see that kind of direction? And then, I saw Michael, actually, if you want to chime in, Michael, on the course.
Yeah, I want to hear what Michael has to say, but just the super short answer here is, it's great to have journals, but I wish sort of the top journals and all journals would publish replications. So then how can we make that happen? That's also Michael.
No, hi, this has been a wonderful conversation. I don't think I have a giant amount to add. I mean, I guess I would just remark about, the replications that our students do. There's often sort of, I think maybe, it was Aaron's remarks about kind of the context for the studies hit home for me, that, a lot of economics, I guess I see, maybe some of my colleagues see, is sort of on the monoculture side. So there's sort of a layer of the things that go unasked, as well as how the studies get designed, that I think motivates many of the students in the class. Although it's true, we've had some very interesting experiences with replicability or non-replicability and reproducibility. Anyway, it's a wonderful conversation. I thank you for sharing the thoughts with us. I'll try to collect my remarks and funnel them through Ina to you all at some point. Thanks.
And just to extend a little bit what Anna was saying about what journals support replicability, I've written, again, I'll just keep providing links, written about incentive restructuring and expressed a lot of skepticism of journals of negative results as being successful. And the basic reason is, if you define a journal's purpose as publishing what no one else will publish, you have defined it as a low status journal. Why would anyone bother submitting there? And so Anna's solution is the right one, which is, how do we start to build in replication to places that already people want to publish in? And that's really, for us, the goal of the top guidelines. This policy framework intervention that we have to try to get journals to adopt explicit policies about transparency and related to reproducibility. And replication is one of those, is just having them be explicit about whether they will consider replications and under what conditions they will.
Any other thoughts here? So we have a lot of great resources and links, and I think Anna, you also are going to maybe send over some, but we could maybe collect those and send them to the participants then. think
Yeah, I
that
mean,
would
if
be good.
anyone wants anything, like any paper, just send me an email. And if anyone wants to discuss something, just send me an email, please.
Great. Any final thoughts or questions? Yeah, we're kind of pushing up against the time as it is, but yeah, this was really fascinating. I think, again, it's rare to get, from different disciplines, people together commenting on this. So we really appreciate you all taking the time. And yeah, I know I have a lot of things to take away from here and think over, and hope to continue the conversation. Okay, thank you, Brian, Anna, and David very much.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
for having us.
Thanks
And
for
Ina for convening us. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yes.
Superb.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye everyone.